Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we speak with Jason Steger, who has just finished up as the books editor of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald after almost 25 years. In that time, he's interviewed everyone from Ian Rankin to Bonnie Garmus, Helen Garner and Tony Birch, and commissioned reviews by the dozen, occasionally incurring the wrath of our very best writers. As he steps back from his full-time role, wrangling thousands of books a year, seriously, you should have seen the way his desk was swallowed by literature. Jason reflects on the state of publishing, the changes and the challenges, as well as some of his most memorable encounters. And hosting this discussion is his longtime colleague and fellow bookworm, senior culture writer for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, Kerrie O'Brien.
Thanks very much, Conrad, and a big welcome to you, Jason Steger. I have to say, initially, congratulations on a stellar career. How does it feel after finishing at the newspapers, having been at The Age and the Herald for 34 years?
Well, feels quite weird, actually. I have a bit more time to do things, but when I first, the first few days after I'd left, it was very strange not coming into the office, not being overwhelmed by books on my desk, not commissioning reviews, and I was able to sit down and read a book without thinking, how can I make use of this?
Now, that must be a joyous thing. I did wonder what the first book might be that you read for pleasure rather than work.
Well, funnily enough, I'm still doing our book newsletter, the book list. So I am thinking about writing that. So books, I've read a couple of books that are going to appear in the newsletter in the not too distant future. But it's been very pleasurable, I can tell you. And actually reading during the day is completely weird.
Delightful. It feels rather indulgent, I think.
It does feel very indulgent, actually.
Excellent. So you've just mentioned being across the many books, something of an avalanche at your desk almost every day of new books arriving. But I wonder, in addition to the challenge of being across all of those releases, one of the biggest challenges of being books editor must be dealing with the authors themselves. And I have to ask, as the person that commissions the reviews, the buck no doubt stops with you. And what happens when a great writer gets a dud review?
Well, it doesn't happen that often, actually, but it varies. Obviously, it depends on the reviewer, because I would never send a book out saying, okay, you've got to give this a favourable review or you've got to bag this book. It's entirely up to the reviewer, and it's all done in completely good faith. Mm-hmm. There have been times when authors have been pretty miffed about some of the reviews that I have published. Mostly that's been fine. I've had a couple of heated phone conversations with writers. I've had a very, very heated conversation, encounter, should I say, with an author's wife. She was very offended by a critical review of her husband's book. But, and actually that particular author was fine about the review. Well, he obviously was probably a bit miffed by it, but he never expressed that disgruntlement to me. Mm-hmm. Mostly, virtually everybody who has received a critical review has been pretty good, I reckon, because if you put your heart and soul into a book and it takes a long time to write a book, a novel, nonfiction, whatever, and then you're on the end of a pretty critical review, I think it must be very disheartening. But of course, one bad review, somebody else might give it a really good review. And the fact of the matter is, if a reviewer is allowed to praise a book, then a reviewer is also allowed to damn a book as well.
Yes. I wonder about whether or not you've received reviews and you've had a completely different personal take on the reviewer's perspective.
Sure. Of course. And I mean, often I haven't read every book that we commission a review of. But yeah, I've read reviews that have been enthusiastic about a book that I might be sort of lukewarm about, and vice versa as well. I mean, I always think that there is always something in a book that makes it worth reading. I think there's always some nugget in there, even a sort of a not very good book. I would very, very rarely give up on a book. Okay. There have been books that I've read that I've wanted to give up on, but I've been obliged to read, and that's been pretty grim at times.
That's very challenging. I always think life's too short to read a bad book. Like if I'm not engaged by about, I don't know, page 30, depending if I'm feeling generous, maybe page 50. But yeah, I will move on. But you haven't had that luxury.
Well, not really, and it's very rare that I would give up on a book. Recently I gave up on a book that I don't know, it just wasn't talking to me, and I wasn't reading it for a specific work purpose. It was a book I wanted to read. I'd heard good things about it, but it just I didn't connect to it. And it's a very personal thing, reading, you know.
Yes.
It's between you and the book, isn't it?
Yeah. You have a particular ability to match reviewers to books, which in itself is an art, I would say. How important are reviewers, and how do you go about choosing them?
I suppose it depends whether it's a fiction or non-fiction. If it's non-fiction, if it's history, say, you need to get some sort of expertise. Fiction, you have to find somebody who is familiar with the author's work. There is possibly subject matter you can match to. Yeah. I always cite this as an example, but it was particularly apt that Richard Flanagan should review Raymond Gator's Romulus, My Father, because Richard's novel, The Sound of One Hand Clapping, was very similar territory, and I just figured he would respond to that book. And he did. He wrote a very, very fine review, and that was a very, very good pairing, in my opinion. Anyway, I mean, other people might not feel that, but if you can get somebody whose sensibility matches that of the author, that's good. Somebody who is familiar with their work, and then that's good.
It's interesting because I was going to say some of the best reviews illuminate something other than just the book at hand, but equally some of the best just look at the book at hand. It can go in both ways, can't it?
It can. I always think that it's good if the reviewer can write a review that tells you about the book, tells you about the author, tells you about the context, and also gives some sort of comment as well. And my view was always that I was thinking about the reader of the review. I wanted the reader to be informed, to be entertained, perhaps to be excited by the book. I didn't think that the reader should go out and buy the book necessarily, but of course that's a bonus. But I wanted the reader to get to the end of the review and think, well, I'm glad I read that. I enjoyed it. And then possibly they might go out and buy it or whatever. But I think that's very, very important to think about the reader of the reviews.
It's interesting. It makes me wonder about the publishers and how your relationship with publishers has been over the years.
Book reviewing is in a sense a form of free advertising for the publishers. But my view is that I'm not getting a book reviewed so that the publisher's sales will go up. It is my review is there for the reader. My responsibility is to the reader. Yes, the book's pages are part of the literary culture, and we play a role, but that's not the primary role, I think. I mean, the reader first, literary culture second, I think.
Yes.
Probably. Some people might disagree with me there. I mean, it is important that books are reviewed. It's really, really important that books are reviewed. It's really, really important that the Australian literary culture gets as much coverage, as many voices commenting on it. But in the end, It's the person who's reading the review. And so in that sense, that is part of the literary culture, I suppose.
Indeed. One thing we spoke about before coming on air was the challenges facing publishers literally in terms of the increase in paper costs, which is not something many of us would consider as a challenge as a reader.
Paper is really expensive and it's the same applies to newspapers. Really, there's a huge cost. I think publishers are doing it a bit tough at the moment. And I think perhaps some of the smaller ones may well have cut back on the print runs. They may well have cut back on the number of books that they publish each year. And they may well be buying in books from overseas, which can often be cheaper to do than buy a book here, commission a book from somebody.
Yep.
I think they're doing it a wee bit tough at the moment, and I think that they do very well under the circumstances. And it's a good job we're coming into the Christmas season because that's really, really important. All the big books are out. Pretty well all the big books are out in September and October. There are a few in November that are big books. But the Christmas season is absolutely crucial to publishers and particularly to booksellers who make a very, very substantial chunk of their annual revenue in those 3 months.
Okay, yeah. I know that you've culled some of your own books when moving house not too long ago, but tell me, what do the bookshelves of a literary editor of 20-odd years look like? Do you have some sort of semblance of order in your bookcase?
The bookcases are full and full to overflowing, has to be said. I think I need to cull a few more books. The problem is that I have always been taking books home to read and not getting to read them. And so now I'm going to try and read all those books that I've meant to read over the past few years and deal with them. My books are to an extent in an order. I know where books are in the house, in the apartment, but they're not necessarily all grouped they're not in alphabetical order or anything like that.
Right.
But I've got, all my Kate Grenville books together, all my Helen Garner books together, all the Winton, Keneally, Carey, Graham Greene, they're all together. So I know if I'm looking for them, I know where to find them.
I wonder, it does segue in nicely to my question about your favourite books of all time. Do you have sort of a couple of titles? Is it possible to narrow down the field to just a handful?
Well, it is difficult. I have 3 sort of favourites that are 2 of which are undoubtedly up there, and one is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, Great Expectations by Dickens. I'm very fond of a book by an English writer called Paul Scott called Staying On, for which I think he won the Booker Prize for that in the late 60s. I think he's the only... I know he died shortly after winning that, which is a lovely book. Mind you, I haven't read that for quite a few years, and I might well get to it again and think, oh no, it's not as good as I thought it was, which is always a frightening thing, I think. I do sometimes find I'm going to, read Jane Austen again, and am I going to love it as much as... Yes. I think chances are I will, though.
I did wonder about that because I am not a rereader, to be honest. I tend to hold on to books I've loved, but I don't often go back to them, rarely, really. But you are a rereader.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a few books that I've read. Anna, I've read 3 times, I think. Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's a fantastic book. Absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
Le Grand Monde by Alain Fournier. That's a wonderful book, which I've read a few times.
What about some local offerings?
Well, I've read The Secret River a few times by Kate Grenville.
Brilliant,
Andrew McGann's Praise I've read a couple of times, 2 or 3 times.
So McGann was a Melbourne-based writer, probably best known for his semi-autobiographical novel Praise, which I think was also adapted into a film in the late 90s. Can you tell us about interviewing him for his final novel, The Rich Man's House?
Well, yes, he just finished the first draft, but he had terminal cancer, and I went to see him at his home in Melbourne, and we sat in the garden in his yard and had a lovely chat. He was very honest about what his fate was. He seemed to have come to terms with it. He talked about the book and that he was afraid that it wasn't as good as it would have been had he had more time to do more work on it. He was very funny in a sort of deadpan way, so he was rolling cigarettes, and his partner said that, well, perhaps you shouldn't smoke, and he said, well, it's not going to kill me, something like that. No, it was as an interview, it was remarkable. He was a remarkable writer. He was a very remarkable man. I think he was a lovely man, and his death was, I think, particularly sad. A great loss, obviously, for his family, and a great loss for Australian literary culture. He was a very, very good writer, and it's such a shame.
It sounds an incredibly intimate interview.
It was a privilege to talk to him, and privilege to talk to him in such detail, and he was so honest about what he was facing, and he certainly didn't hide anything. And it was a very poignant, moving occasion for me. And then when I wrote it, I wanted to do justice to what he had to say, to his book, to his life. And in fact, what's remarkable is that his niece, Anna McGann, won the Vogel Award a couple of years ago, which, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew won for praise.
Oh, incredible.
So that was good.
I wonder, can you tell me about your most challenging interview or difficult?
Well, that was probably one that I was most nervous about, just because of the situation.
Yes.
Most of my interviews have been with writers who are happy to talk,
right,
who are perfectly amenable. I did talk once with Jonathan Franzen, and it was during that interview, right, we were 5 minutes into it, and I was already late with ringing him in. He was in New York. And 5 or 10 minutes into it, there was that earthquake in Melbourne. And that was quite weird because there was this huge bang, and and he could see, we were on Zoom, and he could see the whole place shaking and everything. And I thought a truck had crashed into the side of the apartment.
Oh gosh!
But he said, I said something like, "Oh, what the F is that?" And he said, "It's an earthquake."
Oh, wow.
And the reason he did that was because his second novel was set during earthquakes. And so he'd done an awful lot of research about it. So, I mean, while it was challenging in that sense, it was brilliant because it gave me a wonderful amount of colour to write into the piece.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And look, most writers have been very, very generous in their time. I do remember going once with Richard Flanagan for dinner. It was the evening before an official interview. But because it was relaxed and everything, we had a very nice dinner and had quite a lot to drink. And we talked about the book and we talked about all sorts of things. And I didn't, the next day, I couldn't remember much of it and I hadn't recorded it. And so the next morning we did this interview and we were both a bit hungover and it wasn't quite as good as the night before.
I love to hear that you and Richard Flanagan wrong-nighted it. It's a rich tradition, I've got to say. So Moving on to another, I guess, chapter of your life. For just over a decade, you were a panellist on the ABC's much-loved, much-missed book club alongside Marieke Hardy and co-host Jennifer Byrne. I always felt like it was the book club everyone wished they belonged to, because you had some of the best authors in the world, really, locally and internationally. I wonder what that was like. Any significant memories from your time on the show?
Well, it was fantastic, actually, because when it started, Marieke and I would fly up to Sydney to record it. And we would talk about what was happening with it. And we both thought, well, after about 3 shows, they'll get other regular panellists in. So little did we know that we'd be there for 11 years doing it. It was good to meet a lot of interesting authors. I mean, I remember sitting next to Germaine Greer, who at that stage I hadn't met before. And we were talking about a book, and I actually disagreed with what she was saying. I felt a bit nervous about that because she's a very formidable intellect. But that was great. There were lots of funny occasions one time John Ronson and Will Self were on. I can't remember the title of the book we were talking about, but John Ronson confessed that he had actually listened to the audio version of it and hadn't actually read it. And Will Self was apoplectic about this. The very idea of reading actually being an audio, he thought, no, it's a completely different experience, and got stuck into John quite forcefully. And then, the show finished and we were walking off the set, and I was walking behind them, and Will Self said something about, sorry, I was such a beep, beep, beep out there. It was very funny. It was very funny. But it was fantastic to do, because it was quite weird as well, because basically it was just 5 people sitting around talking about books on television, which is sort of quite weird in a way.
Agree. It made books sexy for television in a way that one mightn't have assumed was possible. Yeah. Clearly an 11-year tenure suggests that, and I'm sure you get feedback. I know you've said
people still say to me, I wish the ABC would bring that show back.
Yes.
It's extraordinary how successful it was in that sense.
Yeah, fantastic. The idea of e-books and Kindles and e-readers, that's been one big change in terms of how we read in the last couple of decades.
Yep.
When I interviewed author Charlotte Wood about being listed for the Booker Prize recently for her wonderful book, Stoneyard Devotional, she said, and I quote, "There's a privacy in the exchange between a reader and a writer that is unmediated and unaffected by outside distraction. And that's what I value in reading." I wonder what you think about that idea.
Well, I think she's right. I mean, possibly writers often say once they've finished their book and it's published and it's out there, it's not theirs anymore. It's so, I mean, in a sense, the intimacy comes between the reader and the text, really. But what's so good about it is that there's nothing mediating the experience. If you listen to an audiobook, then you have somebody else's voice there. So the way you appreciate and interpret the book is slightly influenced by that voice, I think. Obviously, e-readers, Kindles, that sort of thing, it's still a reading experience. It's still an intimate experience. And although when they appeared, e-books were said to announce the death of the book or whatever, that clearly hasn't happened. Obviously, digital books amount to a substantial chunk of the market, but they're not going to get rid of the printed book. And in fact, I think publishers responded really well to the rise of the ebook by doing some clever publishing, by making the designs of their books better, much more attractive things. But Charlotte's comment is entirely accurate, because reading is a very intimate experience. I think.
I wonder, do you feel like you would like to write a book one day?
No. No, I don't think so, because I know how hard it is for authors. I know how many books are completely ignored. And also, you've got to have something good to write about as well. At this stage in my life, I don't have a particular idea about a book. I have thought about it. I did have a vague idea of a novel once, but I don't know. It's too much like hard work in a way. I mean, and it is hard work.
Yes.
Writing is hard work. I mean, you write. I write for well, not so much anymore, but it is hard work. I find it hard anyway.
I must agree. I mean, a 3,000 word feature is one thing, but a 30,000 or 300,000 word, it's just unthinkable, isn't it? Really.
And the thing is, all those books that you read and the prose seems so easy and so to flow so well. That comes from a lot of hard work.
Yes. That brings to mind the Irish writer Claire Keegan and her incredibly spare writing, which I just adore. There's so much work that goes into that seemingly simple prose. She is a master of the short story and has a collection called Antarctica, and she's also written several, they're sort of novellas, they're brief books. Most recent was So Late in the Day, and Small Things Like These was the one before that. And her earlier book, Foster, was adapted into a beautiful film called The Quiet Girl.
And she does not waste a word.
Exactly.
Not
yeah.
at all. And also packs a really powerful punch.
Irish fiction is having a moment with Paul Murray's wonderful book, The Beasting, and Paul Lynch's Booker Prize winning The Prophet Song. Maggie O'Farrell is terrific. I loved her imagining of Shakespeare's son's life called Hamnet from a few years ago. I guess there have been a load of genres emerged during the last few decades. Chick lit is one that comes to mind, despite that dreadful term. And then there's also cli-fi, which is climate fiction.
And here, crime the Australian crime scene is so lively at the moment. And it's a very collegiate genre. The writers all support each other. But it is astonishing the amount of crime, because obviously publishers publish it because it sells. People love reading crime fiction. Whether it's Jane Harper or Gary Disher or Richard Osman or whoever, crime sells everywhere. And there have been some great crime writers.
Absolutely. Peter Temple was one of my lecturers at uni, actually, and he was terrifying. He would write things like, "This is a slight piece of work," which, he cut to the quick, but his fiction is extraordinary.
Fantastic.
I always felt like, and I think it probably is partially because he came from South Africa, that his take on the Australian vernacular was so damn good, wasn't it? It maybe took an outsider to be able to reflect it back
Quite
at us.
Possibly. I mean, he is fantastic. I think his writing, and it was really great that he won the Miles Franklin. He was the first crime writer. I mean, he's called a crime writer. He's more than a crime writer, but no, he was the first crime writer to win the Miles Franklin. But it's interesting the point you make about him being an outsider, because, of course, in recent years, the big bestseller and the most influential crime novel has been The Dry by Jane Harper. And, of course, she's from Britain. And so another case of the two significant crime writers of recent years have both been outsider. But then, of course, if you go back a bit, Peter Corris was really, really influential, because he brought that hard-boiled element to the Australian publishing world, I think, of crime fiction with his character Cliff Hardy. And they were mostly set in Sydney. The ones I've read, mostly set in Sydney, but very, very good.
Right. I read my first John le Carré recently, which I really enjoyed. I think you're a bit of a fan of his.
I've read a lot of John le Carré books.
Yes. Yeah. I wonder, any other genre that you are drawn to sort of again and again?
Well, I do read an awful lot of fiction, literary fiction, and I'm always I read a lot of novels. Yeah. I sometimes think, you must stop reading so many novels, and I do. No, I do like biographies. I've got a biography of Stephen Crane, the American writer, to read. I'm still waiting to get back to start Fiona McCarthy's biography of William Morris, who is sort of possibly the writer who comes closest to being my hero. Histories. I haven't read much history. I need to read more. Trouble is, there's not enough time to read all the books.
Indeed.
That's the real problem.
That's the major challenge, isn't it? I imagine that now you're finishing up as books editor, you'll have a whole lot more time for reading and all sorts of other things, no doubt. Riding your push bike, making your famous marmalade and walking on the beach, among other things.
Well, I'm not sure yet. As I said, I'm carrying on doing the book list, which is our emailed newsletter about books, which covers the weekly reviews, features, and then there's a sort of introduction by me about something. I'll be doing that. I haven't yet. It's early days since I've only been out of the job for a couple of weeks, so
yes.
I haven't got any specific projects yet. I will be asked by writers' festivals to talk to writers at the festivals.
Yes, terrific.
Maybe doing some reviewing.
Fantastic.
And hopefully be commissioned to write the odd piece here and there.
Absolutely. I wonder on the festival front, it feels like there are so many fabulous writers' festivals. Queenscliff Literary Festival is coming up in October over a couple of weekends. Sorrento has just done very well. This is an interesting thing to me, these much smaller festivals with incredibly powerful programs and big names.
Regional festivals are really burgeoning everywhere.
Yes.
And it's fantastic. And maybe people are turning off the big city festivals. I don't know.
In New South Wales, I think Byron Bay was maybe a couple of months ago, and Noosa.
Well, I'm not sure if the Noosa one still goes on, actually.
Okay.
But there's a Central Coast one. There's a South Coast one. Over in the west, there's Margaret River. There's Perth, obviously. South Australia has the Adelaide Writers' Week every year.
Yes.
But it does seem there are more and more regional ones coming up. Particularly, it seems, in Victoria. There's Bendigo.
Yeah.
And there's a non-fiction one in Geelong. And then there are specific genre ones so in Sydney there's Bad Sydney, which is a crime writing festival over a weekend. I think that took place in September.
Actually, Anne Cleeves was here for one in Tassie, trying to think if it was last year, and that was, I'm pretty sure, a dedicated crime festival, which, it shows, that idea with, ebooks, etc., that the book is dead is so far from the truth, isn't it? Really, it's definitely. It's a nonsense,
I was at the Sorrento one earlier this year, and it was just heaving with people.
Brilliant.
And that was only the second instalment. So it's a really, and in that area of Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, so there is, as you mentioned, Sorrento, there's Western Port, which is sort of on the same peninsula, and then literally across the straits there's Queenscliff. So within a small area, there are three writers' festivals, not all at the same time, obviously, but it does show that there is a huge appetite for them.
I remember interviewing Lionel Shriver some years ago, and she said, it's amazing we get any time to write bloody books. We have to be on the festival circuit so much, which I think must be a challenge, actually, especially when you think about writing as a craft being potentially something that attracts a character that's not necessarily wanting to be out there and in the limelight tap dancing. I think writers are obliged to sell their books now.
But I think it's usually in the contract that they have to get out there and sing for their supper. I think. And you may not be a person who's particularly outgoing or extrovert or whatever, but in the end, what you're talking about is your work. So I think, in my experience, most writers are are very keen to talk about their work and are happy to do so. I mean, people do get nervous. I remember I interviewed Zadie Smith once when she'd just published White Teeth. She came to Melbourne for the Writers' Festival. She was obviously a big draw card. I remember we were backstage. She looked out, peeked around the corner to see a full house waiting for her in the Malt House where the festival was then held. And she sort of said, "Oh, my God." And she rushed out to have a cigarette. Then we went on stage, and it took about 20 minutes for her to lift her eyes from the floor and to look at the audience.
Wow.
So she was very inexperienced in those days and very nervous and quite shy. I mean, she'd be completely different now.
Yes.
I mean, she was here a couple of years ago discussing a book with Gia Talento, and obviously she was completely different.
Yes.
But this was her first book, White Teeth, and I think she eventually settled down and talked very eloquently about it.
Yeah, fantastic. Like everything, you grow into it, I guess.
Yeah,
don't
I guess
you,
so.
with
I
age
guess
and
so.
experience.
But it would be for somebody who's not massively keen on talking in public. It would be very difficult, I think.
Well, listen, it's quite the contrary, having you here behind the microphone, and an absolute joy to have a chat. We wish you all the very best with the next chapter, Jason.
Thanks, Kerrie. Thank you.
Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Subscriptions power our newsrooms. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Technical assistance from Julia Carr-Katzel. Editing from Conrad Marshall. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. And Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.